Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Acoustic Agent Expert Series. Today we're going to take what seems like a pretty straightforward loop with just kick, snare and hi-hat. We're going to deconstruct it and find out that even at that supposedly simplest level, there are an awful lot of moving parts to the Acoustic Agent kit. If you'd like to help support my channel, please check out the Patreon link or the YouTube channel membership scheme. I'm a full-time YouTube content producer, so your support really helps carry on making this content. This is the preset I've chosen, the Disco Shaman or Shaman, depending on where you are in the world, and it's in the studio kit, and it sounds like this. Very straightforward. Now today I want to talk about the various different sound components in the drum kit, so we don't actually need the pattern itself. I'm just going to drag this pattern up into Cubase so that we can now switch to the instrument view. And so from this point onwards, I can just press play in the main interface and not worry about the pattern itself. Now, if we just have a quick look at it in the editor, you can see that we've got kick, snare and hi-hat, but there are actually 5 different articulations of the hi-hat to choose from. You can also see that we've got some foot pedal action. That's what's opening and closing the hi-hats. So let's figure out how those sounds are mixed within the Acoustic Agent itself. Now each of the different types of Acoustic Agent kit are slightly different. The controls down in the lower interface down here, the options in the mixer tab, they're all very slightly different. Concentrating on the studio kit today, but in subsequent episodes I'll choose different kits to highlight some of those differences. You can see that we've got 2 different kicks. I'm just going to solo the kick, really focus in on what it's doing. Okay, so obviously got those different sounds to choose from. Take a note of the room and overhead. They're going to play a big part when we come to look at the mixer. We're also going to need to have a conversation about this bleed knob very shortly because it's quite interesting. This is determining how much of the kick drum bleeds into the snare microphone. Now the snare is currently muted, but the bleed knob is independent of that muting. If I completely mute the kick drum and the room and overhead microphones, and we've only got the kick soloed, you shouldn't be able to hear anything. What you're hearing there is the kick bleeding into the snare microphone. So even though the snare pad has been muted, the snare inside the mixer hasn't. So we've got a kind of interesting mixing quirk here. Just bear in mind that bleed is a little bit confusing when you're really trying to isolate sounds. It seems to have kind of a backdoor into the mixer here. Anyway, we've just jumped ahead of ourselves slightly there. I want to get back to the mixer to talk about that in much more detail shortly. Just having a look at the kick drum sound itself. And obviously we want to take care of the stuff like the tuning, to make sure that the kick fundamentally sounds the way we want it to before we start worrying about blending lots of different microphones together. Now, pretty much your attack is always going to want to be at minimum. Having a long attack on a kick just sounds weird. Hold and decay, however, are a slightly different story. Hold is how long the sample gets played for. Because kicks are so short, I think it's perfectly fine to have hold set to the maximum. If you start bringing the decay down, you're going to get the effect of like a really savage gate. There we can hear the sample length being controlled. But I'm quite happy with that as a basic sound for the kick. Now let's have a look at how it works in the mixer. And what you're hearing there is actually 4 different microphones. The kick drum has 2. So we have the main and the additional microphone. ADD stands for additional. We've also got the room and overhead mics. So all of those are combining to make this composite sound. Let's simplify it and hear what each of them sound like on their own. So that's just the main microphone. If we click on it, see the little yellow highlighted box, we've now got the strip, the channel strip, EQ compression, saturation and envelope shaper. And you can see that 3 of those effects are on, and they matter, you know, that they are colouring the sound. If I turn everything off, sounds quite different. I'm just going to turn it up a little bit so that we can hear it a bit more clearly. So all of this stuff matters, the EQ, the cut at 223, the boost at 6K, just giving that little bit of fizz to the kick drum. The compression, we've got fairly gentle compression at 2:1, but it matters. I think it's more to do with the fact that the signal's actually being boosted more than the amount of compression, because it is a gentle compression, but you can definitely hear the sound just getting the lift when the compressor kicks in. And we've also got some envelope shaping, pretty savagely truncating those releases. You can really hear the kick breathe without the envelope shaper, attenuating that release. So this is what I mean about the acoustic agent being a rabbit hole. This is one microphone on one kit piece, and we've got just so many options to play with. This is the additional microphone. Much brighter sound. Let's select it so that we can see what EQ settings we've got. Now you can pretty much ignore the ones where the gain is set to 0 dB because there's no EQ being applied to those. But we've got a heavy attenuation at 500 Hertz. You can hear all of that mud being pulled out. And then we're mixing those two sounds together. They're being fed into the master kick bus, which is here. Now I've chosen a sound today that doesn't have any auxiliary sends, so everything that we're hearing is just the microphones on the kit pieces themselves. Let's mute them and have a listen to what's going on with the room. So obviously this has got much more air. Now just bear in mind that if you start messing with these values, we've got an EQ and an envelope shaper on this room microphone. This is applying to the entire kit. Even though we've soloed just the kick, any changes that you make to the room mics are obviously going to affect the snare and hats as well. Just bear that in mind. Now let's bring the main microphones back in and then head over back to the edit tabs. So this is your primary means of mixing these microphones together. So typically you're not going to do it via this slider here because again it's affecting the entire kit. You do it here. Find a level that sounds nice for you. It's a little bit less reverb than that. The room is just creating a little bit too much space in the cake for me, so I'll just pull it back a bit. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the overheads. Firstly, mute everything. There's the snare bleed. And now that's the kick overhead. Quite tinny, isn't it? It's quite bright. I'm not going to try to mix it though without bringing the main sound back in. And now I can mix to taste. You can really hear all that space. And then finally we can bring the room mic back in for the total overall kick sound. Now that I've done that, generally speaking, I wouldn't mute the kick again. Even though I'm going to bring the snare in now, usually I would leave the kick there because you want to mix the snare, get the snare sounding right in the context of what you've already done. Having said that, just for now, I am going to solo the snare so that we can hear that all on its own. So we need to select the piece so that we've got the right interface underneath. From that point onwards, we can basically just leave it running. This master bleed knob is, think of it like a bus. The kick and the toms have both got bleed knobs on. They're sending bleed into the snare mic, and this master knob is mixing those two external bleeds together to control how much overall bleed. So you can pretty much leave this at maximum if you want, and then control the independent bleeds from the kick and the toms from their individual knobs. Tuning is pretty obvious. Similarly with the kick, I would pretty much leave the attack fully counterclockwise. Now you can really brutalize the snare sample with the hold. So if you want it to be really tight, this is a way that you can do it. It's way too much. That's okay though. Snappy, but it's not sounding unnatural. So from this point onwards, let's bring the kick in and we'll deal with those two pieces together. Just pull it down a little bit so that I can talk more easily over the top. So again, we've got a snare bus, which is controlling your master output, but that in turn is fed from a top microphone and a bottom microphone. The bottom microphone is the one that takes the bleed. So if you really wanted to kind of laser target that bleed that was coming out of the kick drum, you could mute the snare bottom and that would be a way to get rid of it. Let's hear them on their own. So that's just the top. There's the kick, bleeding into the bottom mic. Let's have a look at what settings we've got. So we've got some EQ and envelope shaping on the top snare and tape saturation and envelope shaper on the bottom. So let's see what each of those are doing. That's a pretty subtle EQ. Neither of the gains are particularly savage. But again, the envelope shaper is really being used to attenuate that long release. So the bottom snare is very thin indeed. And again, we've got that bleed. If I head over to the bleed knob of the kick drum, I can take that away. Now you're just hearing the snare. So if you want to control how much bleed you've got, this is pretty much the point at which to do it. When you bring in the snare back in, you can only hear the kick. And now we're just hearing the room and overheads. Hopefully at this point you're getting the idea that there are lots and lots of different angles to hear these sounds from. In this video, I'm not going to go through every single one, but obviously now we can solo the room and overhead just for the snare, hear it on its own, hear what it's doing, bring it back into the mix. And we're basically pulling these two sounds together from all of these different microphones. So just have a think about how many microphones we've brought into play at this point. 2 on the kick, 2 on the snare, and essentially 4 2 each for the room and overheads because they're stereo. See this width knob here? That's controlling the stereo separation of the microphones for the room and overhead. And now finally, we can disengage the solo by clicking the little button in the master interface. Bring the hats back in. Now the hats have got 5 different articulations. One of those is the pedal that's actually opening the hats, but the other 2 are strikes. We've got tips and shanks. So we're going to be able to mix those independently. So starting from the instrument page, we can see here's the shank tip. We don't have any foot. Something that I quite like is I'm more of a fan of hats not fully opening. So I'll quite often bring this down a little bit. You just get it's a more subtle effect. Quite like it. These filter knobs here would be if you wanted to disable those openings. If I turn, for instance, the foot controller off, those CC4 events aren't going to get through anymore. And now it's basically just ringing open. And that's pulling it closed again. And then we've got the mixer. Now the mixer view for the hi-hat is simpler. There's only one mixer strip because all of that control's been done in the main interface with mixing the various different hi-hat sounds together. So fortunately, we don't have yet more options to choose from in the mixer, but there's an absolute slew of EQ. If we just solo the hats for the moment, just listen to how much effect this equalizer is having on the sound of the hats. Pulling away all of those lows and mids. Something else that you're going to need to pay attention to if you've not already got enough things is your pan levels. So you can see here on the main mixer bus, the hi-hats are panned to the right. It's absolutely fine. I'm going to leave them there, but you need to have this like mental ledger, keeping track of where all of your pan settings are. If you've panned one thing to the right, you know, do you want to bring something into the left-hand side to balance these things out? There's so many different things to pay attention to when mixing drums. It is an absolute minefield. I think we'll call it a day for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the like button, and I'll see you for the next one. Thanks very much for watching.